Welcome back, everyone. Just a useful information for all of you. If you're interested in the MCC Summit agenda, please scan the QR codes on your badges, and you can get to know more about the event. And now our next panel. This panel will focus on the problem humanity has been struggling with from the very beginning, and that is namely food shortages and food crisis. But now, we're talking about a global scale. Let me introduce the moderator of this panel discussion, Mr. Máté Litkei, Director of the Climate Policy Institute. The title of this discussion is A New Global Food Crisis a Reality? Please welcome them on the stage.
Thank you very much. I would like also welcome everyone who will be part of this discussion as an audience or as a member of the panel itself. And I would like to thank for all of you to accepting our invitation, and thank you in advance to sharing your thoughts in this very crucial topic, which will be the possible emerging food crisis connected to even climate change, but more importantly to the ongoing Russian-Ukrainian war and soaring energy prices and the energy crisis itself. So I would like to introduce the panelists. First of all, Amanda Martinez, who is an economic risk analyst at UN World Food Programme. Dr. David Laborde Debucquet, Senior Research Fellow, International Food Policy Research Institute. Dr. David Mezei, Head of Agriculture and EU Relations Department, Takarékbank Ltd. And MKB Bank PLC. And last but not least, Tamás Tarpataki, Deputy State Secretary for Agriculture Markets of Hungary, Ministry of Agriculture. So, food scarcity, problems on the global food supply chains. It's a widely discussed topic, but what exactly we mean under the phenomenon of food crisis? How would you define proper food crisis? I would give the floor first to Amanda, please.
It's on? Okay. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I'm honored to be here in this second panel discussing the risk of a looming food crisis. And I will say that we should start with the definition of food security. And the definition of food security, basically implemented by FAO in the 80s, is that food security is the availability and access to food at all times for all people. And basically it has 4 pillars, and the first one is availability, it says enough supply to feed the population of the world. Then the second pillar, that it's related to access, which means that it's not just related to there is sufficient supply of food, but also the economic and social means to access and obviously acquire food through the markets, but also to have sufficient livelihoods to produce crops. And then we have the third pillar regarding the utilization, which means that the consumption of the food should lead to nutritious food, to the proper nutrition of the body, and it's also related to other developmental factors such as access to health, to sanitation, to water. And finally, I think it's the continuity of it. It means that it should be sustainable all the time, not just to access food or have the means just in one moment, but throughout the life cycle. I will say that's the definition. Thank you.
Tamás, anything to add to this? And Another question is, which is also very important, is there any food crisis yet, or it's a problem of the future? How you see it's an ongoing process, or we will experience it in the near or in the far future?
Thank you very much, and good morning everybody as well. I think Amanda gave a comprehensive definition of food crisis defined by the UN. This is a definition of food security. This is a definition of food security on global level or in general. Now what we see is that food is available in the world unevenly. So it's distributed in an uneven way, and that causes regionally or can cause regionally food insecurity, or in worst cases food crisis. And what we can observe today as a consequence of the war, but we'll probably talk much more about it later, than that this war that goes on between Ukraine and Russia, and I'm talking about the armed conflict, actual armed conflict that is going on between Ukraine and Russia, causes regionally shipping problems, quantity problems, and causes an uneven distribution in this region, including North Africa.
David?
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for the invitation. I represent Takarékbank and MKB Bank, and we are responsible for the financement of at least 2 million, roughly 2 million hectares of the 5 million hectares available for agriculture production in Hungary. So we are the biggest player, and we are responsibility in this matter as well, because without proper financement, no agriculture could exist. And when we are talking about food security, I would like to emphasize the access to food, what Amanda already mentioned, that the problem is now in the world in general. I have to emphasize that in general, not the amount of food, but the access to food, because there are at least 800 million people who have no proper access to food, and zero hunger is a very important development goal, one of the most important sustainable development goal, as it's not by accident. So if there's a food crisis, but there's a constant food crisis around the world.
Thank you. David, how you see these regional problems, what the other panelists mentioned, can or could escalate into a global food crisis, or these will remain separate problems in the world? And how can we cope with these inequivalent supplies?
So I think it depends what we mean by global food crisis, in the sense that, yes, during the last century, we have managed to reduce poverty and hunger in drastic proportion. So for most of the Western world, the idea of not having enough food is something that has disappeared, when 60 years ago, it was still something that many countries have learned. And it was through investment, it was through innovation, the fact that, for instance, and I think we will come back to that, but that we have managed to make fertilizer to feed the plant that feed people was a game changer of the last century. Now, since 2015, unfortunately, the number of people that are chronically undernourished on Earth has increased. So it's not yesterday, it's now 7 years that every year we have more and more people in absolute number that face hunger again. So they are not in every country, so of course we may not see them, but the scale and the magnitude is now that we are still 10% of the population that may not have this regular, even caloric intake. I'm not even talking about nutrition and quality of food. That's going to be very important. And here it can be even a wider problem, because we estimate that 3 billion people on Earth doesn't have a healthy diet, for instance. But just a basic thing, you know, this feeling of hunger, we have 10% of the global population that face it. So personally, I think we have a global hunger problem, and the fact that it's increased in the last 7 years, even if not every country face it, it's still a global issue for the global community. Now, yes, we have hotspots. And some are driven by local conflict. So you can think about northern Ethiopia. You can think about Somalia. Some are coming for climate shock, both local and global. The war in Ukraine is adding on this. And of course, we had the COVID crisis that has weakened this capacity of people to buy food, not through the food price, but through their income. And that's what is creating this specific situation that we are facing today. So yes, I think we have a global hunger problem. We may not have a global food crisis problem because everyone is not starting to say, oh, what I'm going... So for most people, I think in the room, the question is, what I am going to eat tomorrow? Not, am I going to eat tomorrow? That's still 10% of the population. So now, but just to conclude on that, I think this year we had a major access problem in some part due to high food prices. We have some worried about next year, especially linked to the crisis on fertilizer, if we are not going to see more shortage of food in other places. Because, yes, this year it was not the production, it was really the price and the capacity of people to pay for it. Next year, that can be a bit different if farmers cannot plant and use fertilizer.
Okay. Tamás, David already mentioned we had some really problematic points in food supply before the war as well. Did we successfully solve these problems, and how this war situation can put a big pressure on those problems, and how can this war make the situation worse if it makes it worse?
Okay, we have to separate two sets of problems that we have faced recently. David has mentioned the COVID, and well, when the pandemic struck in, every country had made individual decisions on logistics, on transportation, on the movement of people. And what we are used to in the European Union is the free movement of people, free movement of goods, free movement of capital, free movement of everything. All of a sudden, from one day to the other, it stopped. Now, there is a huge internal trade in the European Union, especially with regards to agricultural products and foodstuffs. And from one day to the other, transportation has stopped because of the fear from the virus. I have to say it was chaotic, really. And even if the road was free from A to B, from one country to the other, it was very difficult to find drivers who took the risk to take that road. So it was a very, very awkward and special situation which happened all of a sudden, and it created several logistical and supply problems, including food, but not only food, but also food packaging, for example. I give you one example. We had to learn it during the COVID as well. There are those nice boxes we put the milk in, for example, but the box comes separately from the opening part, which is plastic. And we had enough boxes, for example, but not enough opening parts from plastic. And it was very, very difficult to find the ways, and special interventions had to be made, special arrangements with other countries through the border agreements, etc., just to keep the level of the food available and accessible for everyone. So it was an accessibility problem during the COVID. Now we are facing an accessibility problem again, but for very different reasons. Now, Ukraine is one of the largest producers and that's more important, exporters of basic arable crops, products like wheat and maize and soybean and barley and rapeseed and of course sunseed and especially sunseed oil. And because of the armed conflict, because of the lack of workforce in agriculture, because of the lack of fuel in agriculture, because of the lack of available resources, whatever it should be, from seed to machinery or fuel, or workforce, as I said. The production went down, but again, we have to make a distinction. There are autumn crops and there are crops that are sowed in, let's say, March or April, later in the year, and the conflict started in February. So in the autumn, in the fall, everything was all right. Works in the agriculture has been done. And of course, the plants are just growing through the vegetation period. If they have enough water, if they have enough sunshine, if they have enough nutrition. So that goes on by itself, more or less. After the armed conflict, the biggest question was what happens to the works that has to be done in March or in April, namely what will happen to maize and what will happen to sunflower seed. Luckily enough, let's say, because it's already behind us, even in this year, which was affected by the war, the Ukrainian production didn't stop. So the production went down to, let's say, 60–70%, but there is production, there are crops, but then the second problem came: how does it come out from the country? And I don't want to take the floor for too long time, but it's now the problem is how does the crop come out from the country, because it cannot come through the Black Sea, the Azov Sea, because there are warships. Now we have an agreement, thanks to the UN and the Turkish partners, etc. Now ships are coming out of the country with crops, but it's still not enough. So Ukraine has to diversify the export routes for the crops very, very quickly in a short time in order to have all the, it's several 10 million tons we are talking about. So Ukraine, for example, produces like 40 million tons of maize, out of which 30 million goes for export. It's huge quantities. It's not just a few ships or a few trains. So the export of huge quantities must be resolved in a short time.
David, the question is the same. How the previous problems are living with us, how we can cope with them, and how the struggles with the Russian-Ukrainian export can affect the global market.
I think that there is a long-term cause for this price surge, and this is that during the 2010, during these years, for about 10 years, the stable of agricultural products, the price of the agricultural products was very stable in general, and because of this very stable price, the producers didn't have any incentive to intensify the production and to make the investments needed. But the population is growing constantly. But because of the ending stocks, because in most agriculture products there are huge stocks for security reasons, and the markets didn't realize that there were shortages. It takes some time for the markets to realize that there are effectively shortages, market disruptions because of these huge stocks. For example, now in China, according to the data of the U.S. Agriculture Ministry, at least 140 million tons of wheat has in storage, which is equals to at least 1 year consumption of China. And this is around half of the whole global stocks in wheat, for example. So, but there are, parallelly, but there are shortages, for example, in North America. So we have abundance of food at the same time, and there are shortages regionally in other parts of the world. So this is one reason, and the other reason is after the COVID, the relaunch of the economy, the energy crisis, and energy prices have begun to surge. And between energy prices and the agriculture prices, there is a strong correlation. Firstly, because the agriculture is an energy-intensive sector, and not just because of the fertilizer, but also with the machinery which needs fossil fuels. But the other reason for that a considerable part of the agricultural project is used for producing fuel. For example, in the United States, around 40% of total corn production is used for production of biofuels. So almost every second bushel of corn is used to make fuel. So these are the short-term reasons for this. So that's we can see that the last autumn, long before the war, the agriculture prices have begun to surge. So the war, according to our estimation, the war just put some fuel on this fire.
Amanda, the questions are the same, but David already touched the topic of the linkage of energy crisis and possible food crisis. How you see this question?
I would say that just to complement also, there is, since 2021, China started to increase controls on fertilizer exports, and China is a leading partner, so it accounts more than 30% of the global market. So huge amounts of fertilizers declining and not being supplied to countries, agricultural countries, is also stressing food production, and it's declining the yields and the production. And for instance, many Latin American countries rely on the supply of China. So we also have seen this problem, but also as a response to energy prices, they are trying to curb the production because they've seen that it's going to increase a lot. So we've seen that still in a couple of years, the fertilizer prices are going to stay high and also mainly driven by energy crisis. So the energy prices are also high, and we've seen that this is going to affect food production, especially for the most vulnerable. And as he mentioned in the opening question, the thing is also related to finance. How to finance, provide mechanisms to these most vulnerable nations in order that they can have access to all these key agricultural inputs, and in order that they can be more self-sufficient rather than depend more on markets. And then my second point on it is market fragmentation. So we've seen that after the conflict started, we've seen leading partners banning the crop production. So we see, for instance, in India, and that is also a huge supplier. Then we see other nations within Africa, like Ghana, and so on and so forth. So we see that this is the risk also of market fragmentation rather than the solidarity and cooperation that also it's building up on this crisis.
David, I'd like to ask you to reflect.
Yes, no, I think we cover a lot of things. So just to summarize, we were starting this year with low level of inventories, and so your level of inventories is a buffer. So when you have a bad news and you don't have stock, prices are going to go up because the market is not going to supply. And that was coming from a strong demand after the reopening of COVID, in particular coming from China, that was rebuilding actually its food stock, but also to feed its cattle, and actually the pigs that in China were decimated by the African swine fever in the last few years. So strong demand, including also for the biofuel, and that's something that is important for the US, for Europe, but also for Indonesia. So there is policy choices. So you see, it's not just structural aspect, or what people want to eat. There is a policy dimension here. And we had bad supply, mainly coming from climate shock. And I would just want to emphasize that, you know, last year, due to La Nina, that is this global effect, Latin America has produced less 32 million tons of soybean. So all the livestock and the feed market was impacted by that. And Canada and the US had a very bad wheat production. And just to give you an idea when we talk about magnitude, if you take the first 6 months of this year and you compare to last year, Ukraine has exported less 1.5 million tons of wheat. And that's normal because actually Ukraine exports most of this wheat at the end of the year and not at the beginning of the year. The US and Canada together have exported 9 million tons less of wheat. So the major shock on the wheat market was not Ukraine. It was Canada and the US. And it was a weather-driven shock. So people will say, weather is nature, so we cannot do anything about it. But I think in terms of sustainability and climate change, we really have to rethink that, but also in terms of how we make investment to make agriculture more resilient. And, but still, we have spent much more time, discussing the war and the impact of the war than some of the structural things. And this year, we also have good and bad news in terms of harvest around the world. And that's where trade plays a so much important role. Because even if Ukraine has disappeared from the market, even if the US and Canada have reduced their export, we have seen Argentina exporting more, we have seen Brazil exporting more. Normally, Brazil doesn't export wheat. This year, Brazil was sending wheat to Saudi Arabia. So because Saudi Arabia can pay a higher price and a more transparent cost. So global markets actually operate pretty well to rebalance supply and demand. And it is in this context that the issue of export restriction, that sometimes one country, and unfortunately or fortunately, Hungary is one of his examples, say, oh, I may not have enough food, I want to keep it within my border. But if each country starts to think like that, the system cannot operate. Then everyone starts to see, I cannot trust my neighbor, and you try to be self-sufficient, but in a context of climate change, self-sufficiency is not even an option. So really, you see here what we have called, and yes, we have, with this crisis, we have added fuel on the fire, but also we have this perfect storm when you see, when we have climatic shock, combined with bad initial policies in some places, and bad policy response, and at the same time, a geopolitical aspect that also illustrates the role of basic infrastructure. We were talking about Ukraine. So last year, they produced 110 million tons of grain and oilseed. 2/3 of that is normally exported. This year, they are going down to 70 million tons, but most of it go by ships, okay? And even if all the solidarity line that Europe is trying to do and go by land through Poland or through Romania, that's just 10 to 50% of what they need. With the UN deals on the grain initiative, we are just going back to 25% of their current export capacity in the last couple of months, mainly because also the private sector is not really feeling secure, Are you going to send a ship to Odessa? Is it going to come back? At which cost? And that's where all these pieces fit together.
Would you like to add something to this?
Yeah. Thank you very much. Just to make it clear, Hungary did not put any export ban on cereals or grains. There's no export ban whatsoever. Export goes just fine out of Hungary. Everybody can look at the figures. There has been an announcement system put in place for the export of cereals, meat, maize, barley, etc., where the exporters will have to announce to the state the quantity they want to export, and that's it. Full stop. Now, the basis of this announcement system is a right for preemption for the state, which the state has never exerted. Not one single seed of grain has been bought by the state. All exports left the country. Whatever has been announced left the country. Just to make things clear, very clear. Now, I would like to recall also that the European Union had such a system as well, formerly. It's not in place now, but the possibility is there on a European level to have announcement system for the exports. And when the European Union used that tool, it also used a guarantee. So exporters had to pay a guarantee fee for the exports before they export, and if they didn't export it, then the fee just stayed in the European budget. So it's a very soft measure, and generally the intention was to see, because we don't have statistical data in the internal market, which is completely open. Nobody asks what trader takes what amount of wheat or maize to what country in the European Union. There's no statistical data for it, only 3 months after the trade happens. Now that's a bit long time to drive with closed eyes. So the main intention with that instrument was to see much faster what happens on the market than just to look at the statistical data 3 months later. It's a very important thing to see. Once again, not a kilogram of cereal has stayed in Hungary because the state bought it. Thank you.
No, just on this conclusion, I will agree. De facto, the measure didn't have any restrictive impact. Now, how markets have reacted? I can tell you, it was, I think, a Thursday or a Friday that, so I'm not sure if as your minister make a statement, and I received a number of calls as crazy, coming from traders, coming from Brussels, because initially, I think it was even in an interview, it was not even a legal text the first time the things went on the table. But then people were starting to panic, because normally Hungary is a big also maize exporter. Unfortunately, with the drought, in any case, there's not so much to export. So, I mean, that's where also the situation is taking place. But I really want to emphasize how announcement of some policies are going to be interpreted by the markets. And it's very important to have, you know, all the decrees or all what will it mean concretely, because then, yes, on the short run, people were saying, oh, Hungary is going to block export, even if it didn't do it in the COVID-19. And during the COVID-19, we had the same kind of situation with Romania that say, oh, we may want to keep an eye on what's going on. But then in Brussels, people say, okay, you have to explain your policy. You have to announce it. And particularly in Brussels, I would say, people say, maybe you should inform the other governments before saying this on TV or in a newspaper. So de facto, I agree totally with you. It had no impact on what was taking place. But I can tell you during a few days, and in terms of market price volatility, people had no really idea of why, how is it going to be important. It has an impact on the market and price volatility, and so create this access. So very happy that, you know, that it has not led. Once again, I think the European Union operates pretty well, even during the COVID-19. We had faces, you know, a crisis like we have never seen, honestly, in the history of mankind. A global lockdown for a new disease, and how many people in Europe have suffered from hunger linked to that, okay? I mean, at one point, we have to put things in perspective. So no system is perfect, but I still think that the European Union is working pretty well. People try to explain, and we all know that, yes, keeping things moving is important, but I also understand why government want to have an idea of what's going on. I mean, that's very important. To take right decision, you need to know what's going on.
David, as a player of the market, did you see this situation any different when it happened?
Thank you. And it's good to hear that Hungary has an influence on the world market prices, because we kept telling our producers that unfortunately we don't have it. So when we have to explain to the producers, for example, this year, that after May there's a peak of cereal prices around May or in June probably, but from that the market prices have been decreasing, and it's very difficult to explain to our farmers that even though in Hungary there's a serious drought, a historic level, so we cannot even remember this or this kind of severe drought, and there's a very low level of production, and they have to face with decreasing prices at the same time. So our understanding is that Hungary, the grain prices, the world global grain prices, are influenced by much higher producers and much bigger producers and other events than what's happening actually in Hungary. Unfortunately for us. But the problem is coming back to the war, and the problem is with the Black Sea region, that now the biggest player is without any doubt in Russia. And Russia hasn't been a reliable supplier in the past, and we can assume that it won't be a reliable supplier in the future as well. So we have seen that many times, that Russia imposed export taxes, export duties on its production. And when we see the numbers, this is really a concern that within the region, Russia is becoming the biggest player when it comes to, for example, export capacity. For example, in around 2000, Russia has a share of only 2% of global wheat export. Now it's more than 19%. And meanwhile, the global wheat export is doubled. So it's around 200 million tons of wheat which is traded. And in 2000, it was around just 100 million tons. So this is a very considerable achievement and a development. But the problem with this, again, that Russia is not a reliable supplier, or at least its track record doesn't show us.
Amanda, please tell us about the global picture. What will be the social and economic consequences of the food security crisis in countries hardest hit by it?
Well, first, overall, we've seen that the number of people with acute food insecurity has more than tripled, and now we have around 345 million at the brink of starvation. It's very considerable numbers. But again, as we discussed, there is a lot of unequal access to food security throughout the globe, and obviously some regions are going to hit hardest, and the first one are, for example, some Asian and Middle East and sub-Saharan African nations that are directly importing from Russia and Ukraine, but also have high dependency on the fertilizers. So for them, we have seen this. But also there is a compound effect of conflict and also climatic shocks. We've seen, for example, that this is like the sixth, if I'm not mistaken, the sixth consecutive below average rainfall season in the Horn of Africa, with declining crop production. And for them, many of these countries have domestic conflicts also. So they are struggling with the conflict, they're struggling with the climatic shock, and for these people, obviously the poverty is going to increase, but also long-term development is going to be reversed. We are talking the reversion of more than 20 years of SDG progress, especially in terms of poverty reduction, but also food security. So one of the main concerns, and then regarding to the capacities of the government of these nations to look for long-term solutions and to invest in human capital, we are going to see also the reversion and decline in investment in social expenditure, in social protection measures that are really necessary to be put in place to counteract these shocks. So my intake is that. And on top of that, we've seen also some emerging markets struggling with debt crisis. So for them, there going to be a major drop in their fiscal capacities to counteract these shocks, because now they have looming debt repayments on the brink. And we are talking about more than a quarter of $1 trillion in debt that it's due at the end of 2022 and the beginning of 2023. So if these nations do not have sufficient political mechanisms and cooperation within partners and multilateral donors and other creditors, we are going to see many countries defaulting in their payments. And of course, this is going to push more people into poverty.
David, which are the most problematic countries regarding to food supply security problem or crisis, and what can be the global consequences if one of these countries are affected crisis like this?
So I will say, broadly speaking, we have three categories of countries. We have countries that face major food insecurity problem for domestic reasons. So there are countries that are at war, basically. You can think about South Sudan, you can think about Syria, and so on. So, and actually even Afghanistan. Most of the Afghan population face a major hunger crisis right now. So what we can really do, it's really a different type of answer, you know, because first, when it's Afghanistan, do you send aid to Afghanistan? So some government doesn't want to deal with the current government. Same thing for Ethiopia. Can you impose peace when you have a kind of civil war? The fact that we produce more food or we can reduce the price of food actually is not going to change a lot, unfortunately, for this situation. So peace is important. And I will say, overall, peace is key to food security at the country level, at the global level. Market doesn't really like war and instability. And you, if you can get shoot when you go to your grocery shop, you will also feel not very secure also. So, you know, that peace is so important for food security that it should be a priority. Now, you cannot make it happen with just a magic wand. Then you have the second categories of countries that, as Amanda has said, face macroeconomic uncertainty and fragility. You have Sri Lanka. But we have a number of, and not only the poorest country that were the traditional candidate, a lot of emerging countries right now have a big debt crisis. There is also, in a world more uncertain, you see capital leaving the emerging markets to be more secure, investing in the US. So they start to be in shortage of money. And because at the global level we want to fight inflation, central banks are going to raise rates, the cost of debt is going to increase, and you are going to see more and more countries facing major exchange rate problems and not having the fiscal capacity to deploy, for example, social safety net or social program needed. So here it's more what the IMF can do. So, but the problem is not coming from the food system, you know. And finally, we have the country where the problem comes from the food system because there are a drought, for instance, and here we can invest, but you know, today part of what's happened in northern Kenya or in part of soft part of Madagascar, for instance. Now, all of these countries, and kind of the mirror aspect that we had with Hungary on the export side, one by one, they are not big enough to change global markets and global prices. But when you start to have a lot of small or medium countries that face the same difficulties, then put together, they are either big importers or big exporters, and that's where you start to see the consequences. So, just about what we can do, yes, keep market open is important, making sure that farmers can prepare the next crops. Ukraine has a specific challenges, and now we are going to deal with the third crops impacted by the war, but the rest of the world is reacting. So the question, you know, of providing finance to farmers is pretty important, actually. And last but not least, we need global solidarity because otherwise you will see governments that are not able to help their poor to get access to food. That can lead to political instability. 10 years ago, we had the Arab Spring, where this food price crisis was a part of the story why people were in the street and why some government collapsed, and unfortunately, why some countries have collapsed and have still not recovered. Now, I mean, even in the Arab world, people remember what has happened 10 years ago. So even if they are upset about the price of food, you know, they think about what it means to start to go in the street and be upset of the government when we have already been about so many uncertainties. But Latin America and Central America, for instance, is right near a kind of political turmoil. Many places, so maybe Amanda will talk about it, but yeah, so we see these things. And in some cases that can lead to more conflict, in some cases that can lead to more migration, and that's why it's much better, and more generally that would be here my message, it's much more better to act before we are in a full crisis mode, you know? Trying to solve the problem before it explodes is key. When it's too late, it's very, very expensive, and unfortunately what most of the developed economy have done in the last 7 years is to spend more and more on humanitarian spending to solve the problem after it has happened, than to try to spend less before in order to make the system more resilient. But of course, the political economy of acting on preventing risk versus saving life when you see people dying of hunger on TV is not exactly the same.
I agree, peace is very important. So I would like to ask David, according to David's taxonomy, what is the situation in Ukraine right now? So is there a food crisis right now, or there will be a food crisis in Ukraine? And how will it affect to the Hungarian agriculture, and how it will affect the Hungarian food market?
So within Ukraine, I think that apart from the war zone, we can't talk about a food crisis because the domestic production is very firm and very robust. So when we are talking about Ukraine, it's not the level of self-sufficiency, but always we are talking about the level of export. So the question is how much Ukraine could export to the other world. When it comes to the export level, now there are some consignments done, some shipments coming to Hungary because we have to import corn. This is an exceptional year, so at least 20-25 years we never were forced to import corn, and this shipment, the quality, the problem is with the quality. We have very huge problems with the quality because this is a war zone. We cannot control when the shipments coming from. We cannot control, and we cannot monitor the age of these shipments, these quantities. So yes, now due to these agreements, these Black Sea agreements, which should be renewed at the end of October. So because this agreement is terminating, and this is a huge issue, I think that the international community has to resolve. But due to this agreement, the ship routes are working, and also there are some, as I said, there are some grain arriving to Hungary. But the problem is not with the quantity, but the quality. So the biggest problem in Ukraine, not with the production, but again the storage capacities again. We don't know how much storage capacity has been ruined or has been just bombed. So I think that in Ukraine, when we are talking about food crisis, it's still with the food exports we have to talk about.
Thank you, Tamás. How you see what can be the role of the Hungarian agriculture in this changing system?
Hungarian agriculture itself does not matter too much, as we have seen on a global scale. So, of course, we as if you look at the European Union, which is one of the largest agricultural exporter of the world, Hungary is an agricultural exporter country from raw materials, basic crops, and some foodstuffs as well, but not such a big quantities as it would count on a global level. Now, what we see now, as I said, is a very particular situation in the case of Ukraine, which is a large producer and the largest exporter, even on a global scale. And this large exporter does not have the possibility to export in the usual quantities now. And this is the problem that we have to resolve. And part of the solution is Hungary as well, of course. Why? Because, as I explained in my earlier answer, formerly, or in peacetime, Ukraine exports via the Black Sea. 90-something% of their crops. Now, this port has been closed. And that's why it has to find the way, practically via the land transportation, railways and roadways, to export the quantities that needs to leave the country. Why does it need to leave the country? Because storage capacities are, of course, limited. What happens during the year is then you grow a crop, then you harvest a crop, then you store a crop, and then you sell it. Now, if you can't sell it, it stays in the storage, but comes the next crop, and you can't put it anywhere. That's the problem now. That's why the European Union has started an initiative which is called the Solidarity Lane. And of course, countries neighboring Ukraine, like Romania, Slovakia, Poland, and Hungary, has a better role or a more important role in helping Ukraine to let the grains out of the country than, for example, France. of course, it's natural. So that's what Poland does, that's what Slovakia does, Hungary does, Romania does, try to enlarge its capacities of the border to let the Ukrainian grain come through the borders of Ukraine versus via Europe. And another important thing to see is, and that's why I would not like to overestimate the role of Hungary in resolving this problem. We're taking part very actively in it. But you have to see that the main routes for the grains, for the cereals, is the German and the Dutch ports. So the largest chunk what can come out of Ukraine and go through Europe goes through Poland and Germany and the Netherlands. The second largest route is towards Romania. And that's why it was very important to have the talks and have the ships be able to come out from Odessa and the neighboring ports instead of the Azov Sea. Although it's not resolving the whole problem, as I said, because we are talking about tens of millions of tons of grain. And even a large ship will not take more than 60,000 tons. So it should be several ships in a very short time, which is of course not possible because the infrastructure is not prepared for for this amount of shipments, and therefore it is very important still for Ukraine to diversify its routes coming out from Ukraine. And so the most important route is towards the German and the Dutch ports. The second more important route is the Black Sea and to Romania, Constanța. And the third important route is towards the Adriatic Sea. And this is where Hungary comes in. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a hypothetical question, but how you see it, David? If there will be a ceasefire between the two countries, Russia and Ukraine, will we return to the previous routes and processes, or there will be some long-term consequences in the changes of the global market and the regional market?
So it may have long-term consequences for various reasons. But the first thing is, if we don't reopen the Black Sea trade to a normal level, Ukraine will not be able to go through Europe to export everything they used to. Okay? We don't have the capacity. At the same time, this year it's kind of good for Europe to bring more corn from Ukraine and things like this because we have a deficit, a big one, but that's not will be always the case. Last year, for example, the Romanians had a bump harvest in corn, and just themselves with their own infrastructure, they didn't have even enough capacity to export in time. So imagine that we have the same scenario next year. The Ukrainian shipment will be put at the bottom of the list of priorities. So we need the maritime capacity of the Black Sea to come back. And then there is also a cost aspect. Normally, when you're an Ukrainian farmer, you export through the Black Sea, it costs you $50 per ton. Going to Rotterdam right now, it's $200 per ton. So someone has to pay the difference. Today, the farmers in Ukraine, when he has the luck to be part of this shipment. So what it means that, on the world market, price of wheat is 350, everyone is happy, but you receive 150. It's not enough to pay your own cost, and the profitability is going to change. So what we already see that some farmers in Ukraine start to say, okay, I'm going to do other crops, and hopefully that may also contribute to their own food security this year, because if they don't have access to the foreign market, they are not going to pile up grains when they don't have the capacity, when some of these silos have been destroyed, and when already Ukraine has some problem of quality in normal time, but of course in the current situation, it's worse. And knowing that most of the Ukrainian traditional markets are in the south. So why Ukraine has become a key supplier of Egypt? Because through the Black Sea, it's cheap, it's next door, you do it. Now, if you go to Rotterdam and you have to take basically 6 more days of travel, actually you are less competitive than a French exporter from Marseille or even Rouen. So that that we have space matter also, So maybe you want to add on. No, just, okay, so just to say that Yes, we need basically to get peace in the Black Sea. I think one of the key countries that play a critical role is Turkey. Because Turkey imports a lot of Ukraine, imports a lot from Russia, is doing a lot of food processing, including from some of the WFP program, for instance. You know, they bring grains, they make flour, sometimes fortified flour or sunflower oil. So they play a very important play also in the whole system, or we think also of humanitarian activities. Now, if we don't have a ceasefire, Black Sea will remain very difficult for, I think, private sectors to operate in. And investment in Ukrainian agriculture will go down, and that will be a very different world. But I mean, at one point, the Russians also will have interest to make the Black Sea safe again for their own export, because at one point, they had to sell their wheat at a discount price, also to cover the insurance premium in the Black Sea. So, you know, the fact that Russia accepted the first version of the deal with the Turkish pressure, that was also an interest for them. So they still have an interest for renewing it, and I think renewing it is very important. Now, with what's happened on the ground, the president of Russia may be less open-minded and say, I'm going to retaliate by blocking things. You know, but yes, at the end, I would say, for global food security and regional food security, Ukraine and Russia have their part to play. They are big countries with good land. So we cannot just say, okay, we don't want to hear about them. And even, I can tell you, if the Europeans say, I don't want to hear about them and Russia, the rest of the world doesn't care about what Europe will say, you know. You go in Africa, you go in South Asia, wheat from Russia is appreciated today, and actually Russia is going to have a record year in exports through new routes at new costs, but they are going to get their wheat out also.
David, feel free to.
Yes. Just one example with which I can illustrate that how important for Ukraine is logistic and infrastructure. That the Ukrainian agriculture minister, I think that this year in Brussels, asked the European Union to build a pipeline for vegetable oil, to be able to export vegetable oil to Gdańsk in Poland. So apart from the security issues, that a pipeline could be very vulnerable, as we have seen in these days, I have serious concern whether this project could be financially viable. But at the end of the day, I think that it really illustrates this kind of ideas, could really illustrate that what is the main concern for Ukraine in these days.
Okay, now I will open the... yes, sorry, please.
Yes, thank you. Just because ceasefire is probably the easiest question on your list. Yes, a ceasefire would definitely help. Absolutely. That would be heaven in this situation. Absolutely. So in all respects, production, storage, logistics, transportation, whatever, a ceasefire, apart from the fact that finally people wouldn't kill each other, that would be probably the best help.
And now I will open the floor for the audience questions. The first is about the role of the states. Will the states play a more proactive role in the future to avoid future food crisis, or we will return to a free market operation? What do you think? Amanda first, maybe?
I think I will skip that question because I'm not an agricultural market expert. So maybe David, or it's more what's suited to, or anyone who want to take the stand.
Who is brave enough?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll try to. It's of course it's very difficult to say something really concrete on this, something really substantial. I would try to approach from a different side. We always say Hungary is a small, open economic country. It's a member of the European Union. There is a single market in the European Union. And of course, we are a member of the European Union because we wanted to be a member of the European Union and be part of this free market. And we are operating in it as a free market. Now, I have no idea what other countries are planning to do in the near or far future. But all I was saying is that this is the way forward cooperation, trade, allies, etc. So this is how the world develops. And referring to your previous question, who's going to hit worse with that kind of crisis, emerging countries or developed countries? Of course, emerging countries, because they have less possibilities, they have less, they have more dependencies, they have less possibilities, they have less cooperation. For example, here in Europe, we have a common agricultural policy. One pillar of the common agricultural policy is rural development, where people always have the possibility to apply for funds to improve themselves. Developing countries don't have this. Or you even have a possibility for national measures, like we've been talking about debts and loans on a country level or on an individual level. Of course, in this situation where liquidity is very important for the economic players, of course, there is a moratorium for paying back your loans. And that helps. And other countries don't have this possibility. Now, the way forward for them is, of course, trying to find good cooperation, good allies, win-win situations in order to make them more resilient. And that's the key word, what David said as well. We have to improve resilience. And resilience can be improved, of course, easier and better together and not alone. Thank you.
Maybe David?
Yeah, no, so I think that we need government and we need states, okay? And first, agricultural markets in the world are still very far from being free markets everywhere. Many, but more or less, any countries intervene in different way. In some case, they help their farmers. In some case, they hurt their farmers. Because, you know, in some countries, you prefer to protect your urban population versus your rural population. No, what we want is really to see the right set of intervention. And when we talk about food security, one big is social safety net, you know. In your country, it's not everyone that face a malnutrition or hunger problem. Depending where you are, you want to make sure that the poor have enough money to pay for their food. In some cases, you want to make a school feeding program available for your kids, because that's very important. And you don't want to be, because you are born in a poor family, to have less good nutrition. That will mean that all your life, basically, you will have the legacy of what you had to eat during the 5 years of your life. So, you know, social policies are a key pillar of food security. Then there is, of course, policy that impact directly the food system. And I mean, in Europe, in terms of farm policy, we have tried a lot of things, and some very successful, but also very costly, either for the taxpayer or for the environment, and other that may have been less successful, and so on. But for example, the choice of technology. You know, in Europe, at one point, we decided no GMO. That has changed what the farmers in Europe can do. We can be pro, can be against, but just to say that you are forcing your producer to make some restrictive choice that will change their competitiveness globally. This year, we are going to revisit the question of glyphosate. That is one type of pesticide. We have to take decision on gene editing. 2 years ago, a lot of European countries, including France, were saying, no, gene editing is bad, it's like GMO, we don't want to hear about it. Now that we see that we need to increase productivity in a sustainable way, so without using more inputs, that at the end, to go through crisis, it's about innovation, it's about knowledge, so to actually better seed. So we are going to revisit that. So the government is going to make a lot of decisions that are impacting. Some will help, some will not help. We will have to decide, you know, how we price carbon in our economy and how agriculture is going to be part of it. For COP, we take a decision on methane. 2/3 of the methane coming from human activities are linked to agriculture. And at the end will be livestock. So how we deal with the livestock issue for the European Union to deal with the methane pledge. Big policy question. So yes, there you see a place of the government to make the food system still operational, and also that we need to trust. We discuss a bit of quality aspect, you know, but it's very important to have food standard, for instance, you know. Consumers are worried to get sick. So a lot of room for the government. What we just is on the right set of policies at the right place, and hopefully at a cost that is acceptable for the society.
David, anything to add?
Totally agree with you, David, that we now the main task of agriculture community is to increase productivity, or at least retain productivity, but increase the sustainability of the system. So back to the first green revolution back in the 60s, I think that we solved the problem of the quantity. It enabled us to produce enough food, or practically quasi enough food for the world. Now we need a second green revolution, during which we have to resolve the problem is to how to produce enough food in a sustainable way. And I believe that with innovation we can do that. The only way is innovation, but also I can agree with that we have to be very careful with innovation, with new technologies, new technical innovation. But there are technologies which are here, which we can use. The problem, for example, with the European approach to sustainability, that it focuses on how to reduce productivity, how to reduce production. So if we go through the main targets of the European Green Deal, decreasing fertilizer use, decreasing pesticides use, decreasing antibiotics, for example, in animal husbandry, at the end of the day, it will lead to a lower level of production within Europe. And regarding our role, regarding our responsibility in feeding the world, I think that we cannot allow us to do that. We have to we need this green revolution. We need to change our farming methods, but we have to conserve and retain our current level of production, but we have to produce in a much more sustainable way.
Amanda, yes?
Maybe just to add something that I just came up in my mind, that it's within the World Food Program, what we're trying to do is more early action, anticipatory action, not just in terms of what we can provide, but also analyzing the risk and scanning it in order that we can prepare our country offices, our field offices, in order that they can be more proactive rather than reactive to any emergency. And I can come up with some examples that have been shared. It's now that they are trying to microinsurance the smallholder farmers, that it's a segment that is excluded from credit insurance mechanisms, formal mechanisms. So they're trying to cover some part of the premium when, for example, there are a triggering event that is likely to decline yields and crop production. That's just one innovative mechanism, but I think that it needs to be a scale up, not just at the micro level, but maybe complementary service for agricultural, but also providing innovative solutions in terms of assets, but in terms of more adaptive seeds, for example, that we been doing in the last 10 years, for example, in Nicaragua, that they provide to smallholder farmers these adapted seeds that are more resilient because we have a dry corridor, basically meaning that the whole year we have very declined levels of rainfall that impact the production in these regions. And basically, with the help of the government, also we've been trying to raise the production and also raise the production of seeds that are more resilient to these climatic shocks. That's one idea that I can come up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, David?
Just a quick couple of things. I think that, yes, this question of technology, innovation is really important. Some of the Green Deal of the EU, some targets make sense, some other targets I think doesn't still make sense. Once again, in terms of if you want to see, there is no free lunch in the world, you know. So when you say, okay, you are going to produce, have income and use less pesticide, but you don't give you access to gene editing or GMO, at one point things doesn't add up. Okay, so even if it pleases everyone, actually it's not realistic. So this will have to be reassessed, and that clearly the European Union priorities will need to be clear on that. Now also, you know, some target like, oh, we need to use less fertilizer. It's not even a relevant target. The target is, can we make better and cleaner fertilizer? So it's how we produce ammonia. Can we use less fossil fuel as natural gas, especially linked to the crisis? But also, the goal is to increase the efficiency of fertilizer, meaning that for every ton of urea or nutrient you put on the land, it ends up in your corn and not in the water that the city are drinking, you know? So the way that we design policy really matters. But the point I want to add is we should not be also in Europe be selfish, and some of this innovation has to be brought in other countries around the world. Because if we want to deal with this global food security, the point is not just to say, oh, in Europe we can feed the world. I mean, for some sectors, the European Union is very competitive and actually can be also very clean and sustainable. So it will make sense to produce more in Europe. In other cases, we need to produce more in Nicaragua, we need to produce more in Morocco, but small farmers in this community will need support to get access to this technology in terms of property rights, in terms of financial instruments, in terms of training, and that will be part of it, you know, because if we just lift one part of the world and we forget about the other one, we are just going to create inequalities that will still lead to food insecurity problems, geopolitical problems, migration issue, and things like that. So, you know, making sure that the world becomes more sustainable as a group, because also just in terms of climate change, you know, the fact that we save 1 ton of CO2 in Europe, but in Ethiopia, because they don't have the right livestock technology, they increase it by 2, climate change will not be solved.
The next question from the audience will be a little bit provocative. Are there forces in the world today that may actively work to cause food crisis? So in other words, as we saw it in the energy sector, can the food and the agricultural products be the next weapon in the current or in the future warfare? Tamás, maybe.
I rather see it as a consequence, not as a weapon. If one has been here at the opening presentation of Minister Nagy, could see that the price difference between the energy between regions of the world is huge, and Europe is not winning, not on the winning side. That was one statement. Another statement was it was on one of the slides as well, that agriculture counts as an energy-intensive industry or production sector, and these two factors causes the food prices go up and up and up, and still going up. In Hungary, we are in a particularly difficult situation. Inflation rates, I think, has reached 30% in the food sector. And it's less in general or on average, but in the food it has reached 30%. And that does not look very good. Now comes again the question of developed countries and less developed countries, and what have been said already, that of course, thanks God, we still have the money to buy the food, so it's accessible. But it will definitely, well, it has went up, food prices has went up. I think everybody can experience it, and it's not over yet. So I rather see it as a consequence and not as a tool or a weapon, but nevertheless, we'll suffer from it.
David?
Yes, and that's why I think we have to really separate, you know, so energy market and food markets are linked. But now the kind of strategic behavior we see on energy market and on food market are actually different. Because first, you know, on the long run, basically every country in the world can produce food. So you cannot really starve a country on the long run. Of course, you have some city-state like Singapore that needs access, but even, you know, they can find some solution, at least partially. So there is no a big plan by some countries or some corporation to create a food crisis or to create hunger on a long-term basis. That doesn't happen like that. Now, on the short run, first you have government that in their own country use hunger and famine as a weapon. Like they use rape, they use hunger, they starve some part of their country. That's unfortunately happened even this year in various places. But you see that's local things. And after, we see that you can have food diplomacy. Oh, you are my friend, I'm going to sell you more food at a discount rate. Russia is doing it, but honestly, the European Union has done it. The US have done it in the 60s and 70s. You know, India has a very strong self-sufficiency policy because they have a traumatic history about dealing with, unfortunately, the Western countries. They get the big Bengal famine because the British Empire didn't really help them and didn't connect them to the empire. It was a policy decision. Then, when there was the war between India and Pakistan, the US stopped supplying some food product to India to say, don't do the war with Pakistan. So you see, you have some countries that say, okay, we have tried this in the past. We cannot really rely on partners. Is it to create hunger or just to make pressure on the government? In many cases, it's to make pressure. So that's sometimes a side effect. And even if in the news and some policymaker, you will see, oh, President Putin used hunger as a weapon. He's using enough things as a weapon, so let's not put hunger in the balance every day.
Amanda, how you see, should we be worried about this food weapon in Europe or in other countries, for example, third world countries?
No, I totally agree with what been said. I mean, if that were the case, we wouldn't have reached the agreement. So we still have with the grains in Ukraine blocked. But yes, I think that there are some protracted conflicts in the world, and governments are still fighting with insurgent forces. We're still blocking key suppliers, but still it's detrimental for the most vulnerable population because they don't have any means to protect from this instrumentalization of the conflict, of famine, of the food crisis. So I wouldn't say that it's the case, but yes, we have some looming risks that we've been discussed through the panel that are still building up and still providing a great risk of famine and hunger, but especially for fragile countries that are in this fragile setting. So I will say that.
Okay, the last question from the audience is that fertilizer production in Europe has come to halt. What should or what can the EU do to increase production in spite of high natural gas prices? We discussed the two markets are strongly connected. And one of the members of the audience also wrote that no fertilizer, no grain. So what is your opinion about this, Tamás?
First part of the question was what can the European Union do to prevent stops or halts of fertilizer production. Now, what we experience, for those who are not, because from the question it seems that the person who has put forward it probably knows the situation very well. Others may not. So the situation in the fertilizer sector is as follows. Fertilizer costs 7-8 times higher than 1-2 years ago. Not only in Hungary, but in Europe as well. That is to say that the demand for fertilizer has dropped significantly. Now, when there is no demand, there is no point in producing it, even though if it can be sold for a much higher price. So what we see on a European level with fertilizer production, and when I say fertilizer, I mean nitrogen fertilizer, because potassium and phosphorus has nothing to do with this problem. Those are mined. Why nitrogen is produced, and it's produced by using a lot of natural gas as energy and using a lot of natural gas as raw material as well. So that's why the nitrogen fertilizers cost so high. So what can the European Union do? Not much, because the European Union does not really do market interventions. Market interventions, especially in agriculture, were the property of the Common Agricultural Policy before 1990. Ever since, the market interventions has just became smaller and smaller and smaller. There's a free market, and what will help the situation, nevertheless, what we see is that there is an input cost rise for agricultural producers, but there is a food price rise as well. Of course, they have to bridge this too, in time and in space and in production as well. But agricultural producers receive or will receive a higher price for their produce, which will put them into the position of being able to buy higher price inputs. This takes time. Now, what is very important is that fertilizer production, and it's similar in other sectors as well, where we have this chain effect, that on the input side there is already an input cost rise, a huge input cost rise, while on the selling side one does not necessarily have the necessary income to cover those input prices. So this causes a tension in the chain, in the food chain. But hopefully producers, bigger producers will be able to survive this period. And what they do now is they periodically stop production. So they diminish production. They're trying to adapt to the actual demand. And it's predictable that the demand will go up slowly when producers will have the financial means to pay for those higher input prices. The second part of the question was
how it will influence maybe the agricultural production.
No fertilizer, no crop. That's rude. Because the actual production of the harvest, fertilizer is one factor in growing crops. Okay, it's an important factor, especially in large scale production. A factor that cannot be circumvented. It's necessary. It's needed. It can be used very efficiently, but it's only one factor. Thank you.
Yes, David.
Yes, no, so less fertilizer, less production. If you don't use fertilizer at all, the European production can be cut by half or 1/3. But first, we still have fertilizer in Europe, okay? It's just more expensive. And what's happened is right now we are importing them because we cannot produce them locally. As it had been said, you know, we have, broadly speaking, 3 types of fertilizer that are NPK. So P and K are mines. And so here, Europe has very limited source of phosphate within the borders. Potash, Germany has one of the oldest mines of potash, but at the end we will need to bring it from other parts of the world, so the only thing that Europe can do is to use it in the best efficient way with smarter product, for instance, and so innovation on the fertilizer matters. Still on potash, we have one problem to solve is Belarus, actually. Belarus is 20%. To give you an idea, potash is a highly concentrated market. 40% in the world come from Canada, 20% from Russia, 20% from Belarus. With the current crisis, we have a problem with 40% of the world supply. And Belarus was exporting most of its potash through Lithuania. And we closed this even before the invasion for other reasons. So we have a potash issue that will also, I think, require the European Union to rethink how we deal with Belarus in the context. But for what is a basic fertilizer that is N, so it's nitrogenous, and it's ammoniac, it's urea. We make them, and with a process that had been invented 100 years ago, and since then we have not really innovated. And we use natural gas. We break it to keep the hydrogen atoms, and we take the N from the air, and we start to make ammonia. Now, we have to really decarbonize the way that we are dealing with this, and that is basically stop to use fossil fuel to produce ammonia. That's something we call green ammonia. So it's basically you take electricity, and if possible, clean electricity, and you hydrolyze the water. So you take the hydrogen from the H2O in your water. That is going to require public intervention, I think, to make a market big enough and attractive enough to get investment. But Europe should have, at one point, enough energy when we start to replace the natural gas and we think how we deal with it. But we have water and we have technology and investment. And it means also that now new countries and more countries can start to process their own nitrogen if you start to use this pathway. But that's where, you know, the private sector say we have the technology, but right now Also, with the volatility of fertilizer prices, we may not want to do the investment. And that can be good for the environment, good for the sustainability, and good for actually many countries and many farmers. But yes, innovation matters a lot.
Maybe something to add? David?
The good news is that Hungary and Hungarian farmers can meet the Green Deal targets this year as far as concern nitrogen use or fertilizer use. Yes, I think, again, innovation. I think it's very important. I think that it was in September that I think Sweden announced that they will produce a green fertilizer. What does it mean? That, you know, we have already mentioned that fertilizer production is a very energy-intensive process. They will use the Norwegian energy, clear energy produced by water and water powerhouses, and then this is now the first clean green nitrogen fertilizer put on the market. So I think that innovation is very important, and the other stuff is that we have to really reduce our fertilizer consumption in the long run. And there are some solutions at this field. There are some innovations at this field as well. The Hungarian government decided to introduce it as a form of support in our green support scheme, the use of biofertilizers. And biofertilizers mobilize the nitrogen which is in the soil. So there is enough soil. Again, there is enough soil there is enough, enough phosphorus, and enough. Not enough potash, but enough phosphorus in the soil. The problem is that they are not in a soluble form from the plants. And why? One reason for that with modern agricultural technology, we extincted the bacteria, the microorganism in the soil. Now the soil is a dead thing. In many cases, we have to revitalize the soil. We have to bring back life in the soil, and one way for doing this is the use of biofertilizers. And now in Hungary, from the next year, it will be also supported by the Hungarian government. So again, this is an innovation which is in place, and a very important thing that this is available for farmers, because many innovation is right there. The technology, we can use it, but they are not accessible for the farmers, again, and particularly for poor farmers, because they are very expensive. This year I saw new spraying products, a smart sprayer for fertilizers, but it has it is a very deterring cost, because it could cost around 100 million Hungarian forints. Yes, you can decrease your your use of fertilizers by 30 or 40%, but it needs a huge investment. So it's very important that we have technological solutions which are accessible even for poorer farmers throughout the world.
Thank you very much, and I'm really glad that we can close this panel with those optimistic approach. I would like to thank once again for you to participate in this panel discussion. I would like to thank to Amanda Martinez Davila, to Dr. David Laborde Debucquet, Dr. David Mezei, and Dr. Tamás Tarpataki to sharing their thoughts with us. It was very fruitful, I think, and thank you to increase the value of this summit. And thank you for the audience for joining, and I suggest for you to join to the next panel discussion as well. Thank you very much.